Okay, just waiting for Martina. She left for a minute. Okay, I think we can start now. It's 11 p.m. according to my clock. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are in the globe. My name is Tarcisio Saurin, and I'm a professor of industrial engineering in Brazil, and I'm also a member of the Resilience Engineering Association. We are starting now talk 2 of the Resilience Engineering Association series, webinar series, on what knowledge, strategies, and practices do we have at hand to respond in a flexible manner to COVID-19 pandemic. On behalf of the Resilience Engineering Association, I'd like to welcome all participants, and in particular, our speakers, Dr. Martina Ragosta from Deep Blue Consultancy in Italy, and Professor Johan Bergström from Lund University in Sweden, who have kindly accepted to join this talk. I will also be a speaker. Well, we will start with Martina providing an analysis of how the pandemic has affected the aviation industry. Next, we will have Johan, who will offer us a societal resilience perspective of this crisis, besides discussing the Sweden's different approach for the pandemic. I will be the last speaker, bringing some reflections on how complex thinking can help us to make sense of the pandemic. Our handouts are available on the website. So you can, for now, there are only my handouts and Martina's handouts, but Johan will also provide his handouts later on. Please note that this talk is being recorded, and in order to optimize audio quality, microphones of participants are muted, and also please avoid trying to share your camera. You can communicate with us using the chat functionality. After the 3 talks, there will be some time to questions and answers. We will read them out and try to answer in the best way possible. So, as we have lots of interesting talks to discuss and 3 speakers, without further delay, I will give the floor to Martina, our colleague from Italy. Please, Martina.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Tarcisio, for the introduction, and thanks, Yvonne, for the invitation. Without boundaries, where it was possible to easily travel among all countries. And I love traveling, discovering, knowing, and thanks to my job, I got used to travel a lot, at least once, twice per week. And I had also the opportunity to deeply understand what there is behind the scenes, the dark side of air traffic management universe. And at that time, smart working meant, at least for me, the possibility to work from everywhere, far from my office, far from my home as well. But was the same freedom to allow the spread of the virus in a such unexpected and dynamic way. It was a cascade effect of the world without boundaries, and I realized the gravity of the situation only when they started to close these boundaries. Indeed, as some of you know, more than 30 years ago was signed the Schengen Agreement, which led to the creation of the European Schengen area, in which internal border checks have been abolished. It also allowed the free movement of people, flow of goods and services. To contain the spreading of the virus, on March 16, the European Commission recommended to member states to apply a temporary 30 days coordination restriction of all non-essential travel from 30 countries into the Europe. Following the endorsement by the European leaders, all the European member states and all the Schengen associated countries are now applying this travel restriction. On April 8th, the Commission invited member states and not European Schengen countries to extend the temporary restriction on non-essential flights until mid of May. This enormously impacts on all the elements of air traffic management system: airlines, airports, air navigation service providers, regulatory entities and agencies, industries. The aviation domain has been one of the most impacted and affected sectors by the pandemic. I would like to share with you some data and figures. These are just food for thoughts for all of us. According to Eurocontrol, which is the pan-European civil military organization dedicated to supporting European aviation, in the past months there was a variation compared with the equivalent period in 2019 of minus 70–80%, with peak of the network down of 92% during Easter holidays. It was essentially, there was only 2,000 flights in the European sky. So if you are not familiar with the numbers, on the website of the Eurocontrol, there are a lot of visual animation showing flights in different airspace in these days and during the last year. I would like to share with you this. I will try to share the screen. Share screen, okay. Share. I hope that you can see my screen.
Yeah, they can see.
And this is the Eurocontrol website, okay. And you can see on the left side of the screen the flights over all European skies in March last year. And if I move this, you can see now the situation during the last days. So is easily to understand the difference and how the traffic went down during these pandemic events. Then, so you have seen the massive drop in air traffic across the European sky. And then I asked to myself, where are all the remaining aircraft? Essentially, most of them had been packed and grounded and parked at the airports on the runways. And the situation is the same for the airports that are feeling the shock of the coronavirus crisis. They appear like ghosts airports. I would like to share with you these other short 5-second video. Just one more, share screen, okay, please. Copenhagen Airport, and you can see on the runways the aircraft that are parked there because the airport, they don't have enough space for storing all these aircraft. And the situation is similar in a lot of European airports at the moment. The airport seems to be like ghosts with no people around, no passengers. And okay, I can stop now this. Sorry. And the data are similar to the one related to the airlines. Indeed, according to the economic analysis performed by Airport Council International World, at the global level, this pandemic is predicted to wipe out 2/5 of passengers traffic and almost half of revenues for airports in 2020. This is equivalent to 3.5 billion passengers in absolute terms and more than $75 billion by the end of this year. These are just few data, but enough for giving an idea of the impact and how all the elements of the air traffic management are interconnected and how they have been affected by this pandemic. Also, Tarcisio, during his speech, he will talk about the complexity and the different elements and the impact of the pandemic on different elements. And Johan also provided us with a very funny definition of the virus. It's a very democratic virus because it doesn't care of the people, of the differences. It can affect, unfortunately, it can affect everyone and everywhere. Despite at the beginning, we were not ready. We didn't react as a whole system, preferring to focus on our own small countries, probably because we were scared of the unknown and still unknown virus. Then we started to react together, to learn from the experience of the other countries and to collaborate for supporting each other. And these webinars are a proof of what is going on in the world. They offer an holistic perspective on how we are progressively adapting to the surreal situation by transforming and converting previous resources in new ones. Some example from the aviation, for all the aircraft that have been converted for delivering vital goods. I saw this as cargo ones, for flying people home, for helping frontline staff to get to where they are needed. By changing roles and responsibilities, with the creation of hospitals and emergency units, the reallocation of people from one sector to another one, and by allocating funding for dealing with this pandemic. An example is that CANSO, that is the Civil Air Navigation Service Organization, which represents the aircraft management industry And I think also there is Eduardo Garcia attending this webinar. He's the manager for the European Air Traffic Management Coordination and Safety at CANS. Only a few days ago, they welcomed the adoption of a rescue package for European air navigation service providers. Furthermore, Council supported the related proposal enabling Eurocontrol to apply for funding which guarantees a minimum level of financing for the European air navigation service providers until September. So slowly but progressively, we are approaching the phase 2. Different communities are preparing guidelines regarding all the relevant aspects of this pandemic, such as the World Health Organization, which released some indication for avoiding a second wave after the reduction of the prevention measures. I'm quite sure that after these events, our world will be different, but we have to find a new equilibrium for being able to be free and to fly again over the globe. So thanks for listening, and I will give the floor to Johan.
Okay, thanks, Martina. Then we can move from Italy to Sweden.
Let's do so. Thank you, Tarcisio. Thank you, Martina, for an interesting talk. And thank you, Yvonne and the Resilience Engineering Association for the opportunities to share some thoughts in this session. And sorry for not putting on enough makeup for managing the lighting here. We have some great weather in Scandinavia currently. So I thought that I should start with saying something about how I've studied resilience previously and up until now. I, some 10 years ago, did what would be labeled resilience engineering research for my PhD. Mostly studies in obstetric care as an outsider without previous healthcare experience. And then for my postdoc, I wanted a sort of different approach. So I still wanted to study resilience, but studied the introduction of resilience as an object of knowledge in the wider discourse on societal safety and security. So that would, for instance, be national resilience policy. And I compared the introduction of resilience into the societal safety and security discourse in Sweden, Australia, and Brazil. Tarcisio, Porto Alegre, selected as one of Rockefeller Foundation's 100 resilient cities for their campaign. A disclaimer for this short presentation is that I do not have any ongoing research projects into the COVID-19 situation. I'm just a resilience nerd and curious citizen. And in my talk, I will definitely ask more questions than provide any answers. But in my postdoc especially, I was interested in how resilience became, and still perhaps is, a politically convenient construct, and how it helps to define interactions and relations between societal levels. So one question that I asked in that research, and that could be relevant here today, is whether resilience measures are implemented as empowerment or responsibilization of citizens. So it comes down to that. How are we treating our citizens by the response measures that we are now taking? Are we empowering them? Are we responsibilizing them? Or are we even perhaps abandoning them? In the literature, empowerment is sometimes defined as providing choice and voice. So are we? Are we giving choice and voice to citizens? Do we make sure that they have the adaptive capacities to adapt in the first place? And what would that even look like? Or are we simply asking people to take the responsibility for managing or even avoiding a situation which we were unable to mitigate as a society in the first place? In that case, resilience by responsibilizing would be to ask the local level to adapt without making sure that they have the necessary capacities to do so in the first place. And And this is a sociological critique, which is very much present in the resilience, the wider resilience literature, I would say. And a good example of that would be to have a look at Evans and Reed's writings, especially their book, Resilient Life, The Art of Living Dangerously, is a fascinating read. So the question is, are we now compensating for the fact that we are not able to care for each other by putting us all in a lockdown? And is it then fair to ask citizens to take the responsibility for and even perhaps embody the adaptive capacities of our societies? And do we even have such adaptive capacities to begin with? And so the next question then becomes, are the national adaptive strategies democratic? There are multiple warning signals now of how various states worldwide takes a response in an authoritarian direction. India, Hungary, which is currently governed through cabinet directive, Poland, Serbia, Israel with closed courts and suspended parliament. Journalism seems to be hit hard worldwide. Journalists are threatened with punishment for publishing critique of national measures in several of the countries described above and others. So many of the measures taken to adapt seem to take us in a more authoritarian direction. And could this even fit with a resilience analysis framework is an interesting question to ask. Could we as resilience scholars ever conclude that democracies are bad at adapting while authoritarian regimes are more resilient? And in order to do so, we would, at least as Western scholars, have to let go of the normative idea of resilience always being a positive and a good thing. And I think that would be a fruitful exercise to do, to try to let go of resilience as that kind of normative construct. So is Corona a democratic risk even? Martina touched upon this in her introduction. This comes back to risk sociologist Beck's risk society thesis that risk exposure is supposed to be democratic. Now, that's something that has been disputed a lot and debated a lot since he published that, following events such as Bhopal, for instance. I don't know, Tarcisio, what about the situation in Brazilian favelas? What about social distancing there? Access to clean water for hand washing? Also here in Sweden, what we see is that the spread has been worse in the Stockholm suburbs, where several generations of people within one family live together in rather small flats. The US, with the distributed even access to, or the segregated access to healthcare. Is Corona a democratic risk? I'm encouraged to work from home, but who can do that? Typically, this possibility is also a privilege for middle class and up. That's another aspect of class to the Corona outbreak. Another question to ask is whether this is a known and accepted risk to begin with. What you see here in this little slide is a headline from The Guardian saying Labour urges UK government to publish findings of a 2016 pandemic drill, which I think still it has been reluctant to do. It's an ongoing controversy in the UK. Following the bird flu in 2005 and 2006, a global pandemic, and even before that, has been high on the list of potential future global crises. But perhaps the cost of ensuring adaptive capacities for it are simply too high for us to accept as a society, and then we find ourselves in the situation where we are today. And what I think, and have argued before, is that this discussion about accepted risk is typically one that we have failed to have within the resilience debate. Resilience has sort of become the ability to deal with anything in complex times and systems. And how do you even show your resilience without accepting risk? Resilience requires risk. Without great risk, we cannot prove how resilient we actually are. And so I would like us to also include a discussion about what risks we think are fair to ask people to adapt to once they hit the fan and become actual crisis scenarios. What we also see now is resilient behavior in brittle systems. That's to discuss difference in resilience across or between system scales and aggregation levels. So instead of discussing what risks which are fair to expose people to, the resilience discussions sometimes tend to celebrate those times where people have shown resilience. And I will paraphrase Richard Cook saying, we have typically studied resilience despite systems rather than resilience thanks to systems. And yes, nurses who make their own protective equipment in their kitchens before going to work are great examples of resilience. But it's simply not fair to have put them in that situation in the first place, is what I would argue. And there are currently numerous such examples. And as resilience scholars, I think we need to keep these two thoughts in the head at the same time. Yes, we see resilience, but we see it because the system is brittle and did not provide the adaptive capacities to begin with. Then it also seems like the corona crisis does not follow the logics of the intended crisis, the crisis which we did prepare for and did have our yearly campaigns to prepare people for how to adapt to. This is a situation which is not solved by generic guidance for making sure that we have drinking water and food at home for the next 72 hours. The adaptive capacities needed are different, and the idea that a crisis is a hit which takes 72 hours for society to sort of adapt to and cope with is flawed and has probably always been. It's a heritage from nuclear war preparation that we still sort of re-celebrate today and reproduce today. And also, this idea that societal flows are simply interacted seems flawed, at least for this ongoing scenario. Some are, especially much needed healthcare equipment manufactured in China, of which we have no stocks. But for instance, we are not running out of toilet paper, even though we seem to believe that we are. Other interesting data which has currently come out of Swedish surveys is that adaptation also seems gendered. Big surveys made just recently on the ongoing situation shows that women are more likely to adapt their behavior to a greater extent than men, and also that women are more worried about the ongoing situation than men. But this also confirms risk perception research made back in the 80s by Slovic and others, coining the white male syndrome, another aspect of sort of how at least the perceived risk exposure will differ with power structures, privileges, in this case, gender. We also see many sacrificing decisions and goal conflicts. And this is another point to keep in mind when studying resilience, is what I could call focusing on the object of resilience. What are we actually protecting by the adaptive capacities that we apply? In this case, it's sort of the balancing act, if you like, between protecting lives, especially the lives of elderly, healthcare functionality, economic growth and jobs, and public health, because it is not good to be indoors all day for several months in a row, especially not if you are elderly. Access to quality education, etc. So resilience is also not one universal concept that will embrace all of these at the same time. There will be goal conflicts, and adapting to protect certain values also means sacrificing others. And I think we see a lot of that currently. Then something which we are observing at the moment, and Martina mentioned also this as an exchange of people across sectors. I played a bit with language here, and we'll call it graceful exchangeability, which is an interesting example of adaptation that I think is ongoing now. For instance, here is an example of the Swedish truck manufacturer Scania, who've sent all their production staff to go to another company called Getinge to produce healthcare ventilators instead. And we just recently, last week, there were short transition courses for taking cabin crew of Scandinavian Airlines and other airlines and give them a short, I think, 3-day course to act as some kind of service personnel in the healthcare system. Graceful exchangeability, but quite interesting to see what could be sort of an extension of high reliability theory, if you like, high reliability societies, perhaps, with this kind of functional flexibility, which I think is really interesting to observe currently. I also promised to comment on the Swedish response, which is getting sort of attraction in worldwide and is debated worldwide. Is the Swedish response an experiment? Yes, of course it is, but so are all other responses as well. It's pictured as perhaps more liberal than others, and to some extent that's true, I guess. It comes down very much to the Swedish political model with independent expert authorities, such as the Public Health Agency, which is currently in the media all the time. There is no politically appointed crisis general, but great reliance instead on the advice from our expert authorities. But then the expert authorities cannot order people what to do or how to behave. What they can do is appeal to our motivation and adaptive capacities and say, please don't meet in big groups. Please don't go on a skiing vacation. And this is pretty much how things have been done so far. So the expert authority also believes then that measures such as a school closure would have too big of a negative impact, and so they are advising against it. And politicians have then followed this advice to not go ahead to pass laws against the will of the expert authority, or go in to try to govern the expert authority. That's what's highly illegal by politicians to do. And perhaps this Swedish response is one of the foremost examples of neoliberal resilience as an appeal to local citizens to do the right thing, take care of themselves and each other without the involvement of the state. Is it empowering? Is it responsibilizing? We'll see, perhaps. And there are debates here currently ongoing, which are really interesting also on getting back the war and crisis preparedness supplies that we used to have during the Cold War. In Finland, they still have them. Back in 1990, we had 900 military ventilators in stock. And after the Cold War, we sold them. And today we have a total, for a population of 10 million people, we have a total of 526 intensive care beds, I think. And we are now working to build new ones, partly with usually truck building personnel. And we are also working on finding ways to relocate existing ventilators, to share them across regions, for regions where there is a need, such as Stockholm currently. So to sum up these 15 minutes, there is indeed a risk of a non-democratic responsibilization of citizens without giving them choice, voice, or necessary adaptive capacities, such as livelihood in lockdown periods, to cope with this outbreak. And we seem to be responding to a well-known risk for which we also seem to have not prioritized investing in adaptive capacities to cope with it. And now we are facing the consequences of that. Adaptive capacities and possibly even the willingness to adapt are most likely also connected to social class and gender structures, the power structures of our societies. And we should always ask when doing resilience studies, the resilience of what? Economy, health, public education. There are always goal conflicts in terms of what values to protect and what adaptive capacities to harness. And we see fascinating examples of societal flexibility and the relocation of resources currently that are really interesting to observe. And yeah, we are all experimenting. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Johan. Congratulations for the nice special effects. They were great, in addition to the contents of the talk itself. Well, now I will provide a kind of more theoretical perspective, an additional theoretical perspective, offering a complexity thinking viewpoint on the pandemics. As the previous speakers made it clear, there are far-reaching impacts from this pandemic, and so it's clearly a systems problem. So the aim of my talk is to offer some reflections on the pandemic from the viewpoint of complex thinking. Of course, there are lots of possible perspectives for making sense of this crisis. All of them are valuable and complementary, economic, psychological, societal perspectives. But I think that complex thinking is a relevant perspective for us as resilience engineering researchers and practitioners, as we are interested mostly in understanding and influence resilient performance in complex systems. I have heard some people saying that the fast forward button of history is pressed in pandemics, which means that changes in society and knowledge evolves at a fast pace in these moments. Many things that seem to be hard to implement suddenly became a reality overnight. For example, home office, homeschooling, and many other things in our daily lives. I think that this also applies to resilience engineering. I think we have an opportunity now, a unique opportunity to produce new knowledge and innovation as a result of this crisis as a community. And this webinar series is providing a contribution for that. Well, returning to complexity, I will also start providing an account of the rise of the pandemic from a complexity lens. Firstly, I think it's worth noting that the pandemic is not limited to one particular type of complex system, but it rather encompasses a wide variety of interconnected complex systems. It's not only about healthcare, of course, it's about manufacturing and food supply chains, economic and political systems. It's about our personal microsystems in our personal lives. So the scale of the systems involved is much higher than those we are used to deal with in our normal professional or academic work. Then complex thinking provides an effective lens for understanding the rise of the pandemic and its spread. I think that we could frame the rise of the pandemic as essentially related to dynamic interactions, which are a defining feature of complexity. So everyone knows that the pandemic can be traced back to interactions between humans and wildlife. Everybody heard about the story of the wildlife market in China. And this has happened because more and more we have been interacting with natural habitats, invading their habitats. And these are undesired interactions. They shouldn't be happening at this way. So, furthermore, as it usually occurs in complex systems, these interactions spread non-linearly. In this case, in our current pandemic, they are spreading at the speed of air travel. In fact, in past pandemics, centuries ago, they probably spread at a much slower pace. One of the most amazing and shocking things of this pandemic for me is the speed of the propagation of the pandemic. And I wonder whether we should pay more attention to this variable when modeling complex systems. By this variable, I mean the speed of the interactions. There have passed only 5 months since the outbreak started in China, and it's now everywhere across all continents and in small towns in the countryside where people have never been abroad. I have no data from earlier pandemics, but I wonder how this crisis speed compares to previous pandemics, for example, the Spanish flu pandemics a century ago. Well, complexity has also amplified the impacts of the pandemic. This has a strong relation with tightly coupled supply chains designed to work just in time. These supply chains have not been able to cope with the surging demand for cheap supplies. The most well-known example relates to face masks. Everybody has heard about the masks war involving several countries. And there are also an over-reliance on foreign suppliers. The face masks, again, is a good example here. This over-reliance on foreign suppliers adds interactions that are out of our control as independent nations. So this adds complexity to these supply chains. Another point related to supply chains, which has amplified the effects of this pandemic, refers to how trade-offs have been managed in these supply chains. It seems to be clear now that these trade-offs have been unbalanced in favor of short-term efficiency in detriment to safety. So a broader question that arises here is related to how current dominant economic models should be followed, should be keeping being adopted in the future. There have been some debates on whether neoliberal economic policies have consumed societal resilience. Johan has provided some insights into this. Furthermore, I think that the effects of the pandemic have also been amplified by diversity, which is also a defining feature of complex systems. The pandemic has made it clear that not all elements are equal in complex systems. This point has been discussed also by Martina and Johan. We can discuss this diversity specifically in terms of diversity of power and diversity of income. It has been clear that there is a diversity of power between countries and between individuals, and this is expected to have an impact on the outcomes of the pandemic. At the international level, you have heard about the competition for masks and ventilators. Developing nations like Brazil and many others are struggling to buy the supplies, but they simply cannot be left behind for much longer, because outbreaks in Brazil or in other countries will sooner or later spread again to rich countries. At a national level, in Brazil, I wonder whether the situation is similar in other countries. The epidemic started here at the middle class, with people who were abroad on holidays. January and February are the most busy holiday months in Brazil. So there were many people abroad, and those people brought the pandemic to Brazil. So the first hospitals to become overloaded by COVID-19 in Brazil are the richest hospitals, the private hospitals for richest people. The pandemic has not yet overloaded the public health system. Apart from some places in the Amazon, there is a large city in the Amazon, Manaus, which is the first major city in Brazil, which has collapsed because of COVID-19. São Paulo is approaching collapse as well. but in most other places, the situation is relatively under control so far. Well, there are also evidence from other countries, from the US, that the pandemic has affected mostly poorer people, has disproportionately affected poorer people in some regions. In a more micro level, I think that both in developed and in developing nations, we can see differences in individual differences between families. For example, richer families have moved to their second homes in the countryside at the risk of spreading the disease further. And these examples that I have provided at the international, national, and individual level, they are also related to another feature of complex systems, which is fractality, which means that the same properties manifest across several scales of a complex system. Well, while complexity has contributed to the rise of the pandemic, I think that complexity will play a role. It has played a role for coping with the pandemic and for eventually ending the pandemic. In fact, our first response everywhere was to fight complexity by destroying it. Our first action was to break down the chain of interactions through lockdowns, quarantines, social distancing, and closing of borders. I personally find it quite frustrating because it has been the same measure adopted for centuries. And I think that this shows that our adaptive capacities as societies are still quite limited and maybe quite primitive, I would say. Anyway, these measures have been important, of course, because they have given us some slack to develop sustainable, resilient performance and to develop complex responses. I will now mention quite briefly some of these complex responses that have been adopted. They are mostly widely known, and frame them within a set of guidelines for coping with complexity. I have been using these guidelines as a basis for my work in recent years. The first guideline refers to taking advantage of diverse perspectives. This is a way of taking advantage of the upside of diversity. As I mentioned before, diversity can amplify the effects of the pandemic, but there is also an upside from diversity. Well, an example of applying this guideline refers to the sharing of information among healthcare professionals. Knowledge on the virus has evolved at an unprecedented speed, partly due to collaborative efforts worldwide. This is an excellent example of working across boundaries in healthcare. Another example, lots of technological and organizational innovations have been developed as a result of this crisis. Crises are usually a catalyzer for innovation. For example, in our teaching hospital in my university, nurses have developed a new protocol for sterilizing, for reusing N95 masks. This has been critical because there is a lack of this personal protective equipment. Well, another guideline which I think is very important, which has received lots of attention in this crisis, refers to providing providing extra resources to cope with variability. There are lots of opportunistic slack resources emerging from this crisis. For example, Johan and Martina showed some examples. For example, students producing face masks at our university in Brazil, factories changing their production lines, hotel rooms being used for quarantines, and so on. I think this pandemic has shown that while Slack is costly, the price of not having Slack has proven to be too big. So this will be probably, I hope, one of the main lessons from this crisis. Value to acknowledging the importance of Slack. The third guideline refers to giving visibility to processes and outcomes. This is a means to reduce perceived complexity. Visibility is a key in this crisis because the threat is invisible, including asymptomatic people. So, for example, there is a need for transparent data on how the outbreak is evolving at local, national, and international levels. I wonder whether the participants of the webinar could say which neighborhoods are hotspots of the virus where they live. I can't say this where I live in Brazil. And visibility can, at the end, empower people to better protect themselves, supporting sustained resilient performance at the micro level. We will start to live with the virus soon. This will be the next phase of this pandemic in several countries when restrictions are lifted. Well, the last guideline refers to understanding and monitoring work as done as a basis for making changes. According to complexity science, most of you know, it's unavoidable, a gap between work as imagined and work as done. So in several healthcare services, overnight, several routine activities have changed. And it's very hard to leave behind the old way of working, which may increase the likelihood of errors. For example, I have heard reports that in some places, caregivers have spent more than 1 hour a day wearing protective gear. And added to this, the time spent washing hands. So it's probably, it's certainly impossible to follow standardized procedures. In this respect, I exchanged some emails yesterday with a colleague from Australia, a patient safety expert, Jeffrey Braithwaite, and he used a good expression, which I think is applicable here. According to Jeffrey, we should search for the sweet spot between excessively standardized care and anything goes. So, and I think that us as healthcare services researchers, as resilience engineering researchers, we can help to find a middle term in this situation. Well, that's all from me. I talked for more than 15 minutes, sorry. And we have now 10 minutes for questions and answers. So our participants are welcome to communicate with us through the chat functionality.
They've started to use the Q&A function. So if you click on Q&A, Tarcisio, you will see some fascinating questions.
Ah, sorry, Johan, sorry. Okay. A question for Marlon from Brazil. In face of COVID-19 pandemic, ethical dilemmas, give a ventilator to a young person or an elderly. Ethical dilemmas have become a key factor in decision making. How ethical questions should be approached under a resilience lens? Who wants to start? Perhaps you?
Fabulous question, Marlon. I wonder if it's possible. I've critiqued sort of the resilience lens for not being really able to incorporate such an ethical lens. because of its sort of normative optimism that runs through the entire resilience discourse. So I would love to hear the attendees' thoughts and around this. I really don't have an answer, but it's a fascinating question.
Yeah, I don't think resilience engineering has a clear position on this, but we certainly
That's
should.
safety 3 then.
Okay, another question from Matteo Branlat from Norway. In your mind, how does the resilience concepts and tools inform the return to normal recovery phase societies are starting to discuss and potentially implement? They are progressively abandoning restrictions and reopening basic services, for example, schools. I think, okay, I can provide my take here. I think resilience engineering is about providing tools for adaptation. Not tools, providing necessary resources for adaptation. For example, I was talking about visibility. A key point here is to make hazards, is to make sources of hazards visible for people as a whole. I think information technology can help here. There are some apps being developed in several places. Of course, testing, but I think it's about providing resources for adapting at the individual level. You know, Johan, Martina.
Yeah, I think I would prefer not talk about return to normal, but we should recover from the situation, because we will reach a new normality if it will be possible. And in my opinion, resilience has to support people in understanding the situation, in being aware of the adaptation strategies, in empower people in daily life activities. And this will be done, this could be done by apps or some new technologies in helping people, also in interacting with the others, because we are all humans and we need also to human interaction between human and human, not only between human and machine. So I think is in this way that resilience can help in supporting society in come back to the daily life. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Victor, I think from Portugal. Where is the complexity? In the spreading model or in the impact of the mitigation measure? I think it's in both, in my view. I think complexity is in the social technical system involved in the countries, companies, supply chains. And I also that the responses are also complex in the sense that they involve lots of interactions, lot of innovation, lots of adaptation. And I think the responses should be complex, because in order to cope with complex problems, there should be compatible complex responses as well, in order to match the variability, in order to match the variety of the problem. We need also a variety in the solution. Okay, a question from Brian Smith. How would graceful exchangeability work in aviation environment, such as the flight deck, where the crew provided the final element of operational resilience? Perhaps a question for JB and Martina.
No, stupid me who coined the term. No, but I don't know if it is actually that applicable. I was playing with Woodsian language on graceful. Extensibility, of course, but I don't know graceful exchangeability in an aviation environment such as flight tech. That sounds more like some kind of social redundancy theory from high reliability theory or something, which could indeed be very interesting to explore. I mean, I think that was fascinating a couple of years ago when, and I don't know if that's still the case, when cabin crew was supposed to stand in the cockpit and guard what was going on if one of the crew members in cockpit went to the loo. What about the social redundancy there? So that might be where the graceful exchangeability would head for an operative environment like that.
Okay, so we are on time. I would like to thank again all speakers, all participants. And I would like also to remind you all that this series continues, and next Monday there will be talk 3. You are all invited to be here again. You can check more details on next webinar on the Resilience Engineering Association website. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao. Okay. Thanks, Johan. Thanks, Martina. Sorry.
Thank you, Tarcisio. You can abort the recording now as well.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for speaking too much.
That was interesting. It's nice to hear you. You get inspired.
Yeah.